All right, so we're back, and those of you online, welcome back. I see that my co-director, John Shook, is there. So the co-director of the Institute has actually been with us for most of the morning, and I want to thank him for all his work with the Institute, and especially getting it started. I don't have anything extra to add that I haven't already put at the front of some other talk, so we're getting to the point where we just should get to your paper, Alan. So I ran across Alan's work 10 years ago, as I said this morning, and have found it to be incredibly well written, lucid and clear, understandable to dedicated and educated people who want to read it. It's not that it's not difficult, it's just that in terms of the power of communicating, Alan's books has this power, and that's part of the reason he's won all these awards. I have no doubt it's because people like to read what he writes. And so anyway, Alan Mittleman holds a fancy endowed chair at Jewish Theological Seminary in New York, and has written more books than you could shake a crooked stick at, and let alone a straight one. And so I invite you to look at this, at the three that I have here, and imagine many more like them. But with that said, I'm going to invite Alan Mittleman to come and speak. It's an honor, Alan, to have you here. Oh, I might need this. Depends on what you're going to say.
We can find a home for it.
Thank you, Randy.
Maybe.
Very glad to be here, and I thank Randy for inviting me, and Len for inviting me too. Helping to set this up. So I came to Coming to Mind about 10 years ago, not because I had any particular interest in the topic, but because I had a particular interest in the writing of Len Goodman. So I tried to read most of Len's work, and I always used to say that if I were ever to be stuck on a desert island for the rest of my life, and I could only take one book with me, I would take his book, God of Abraham. I think that would give me enough stimulation to last for probably the week or two that I'd last on the desert island. At any rate, I'm just sort of disclaiming any expert knowledge here, but I wrote a review of the book. It came out in 2014, a review essay in the Harvard Theological Review, and I read the book very, very carefully, and I think I did justice to its thesis in the review. But I also raised, some disquiet that I had, some criticism. So in a sense, with this little talk, I reread the book very quickly a few weeks ago to try to get back into it, but I think I make good on the sort of cultivating the criticisms that I had back then. I definitely do not in this little piece spend as much time laying out the thesis of the book or anything like that. So if you're not really familiar with the book, this might be a little bit too inside baseball. I don't know, but we'll see. Coming to Mind, The Soul and Its Body is a wise, generous, and courageous book. It is wise because it seeks to put the dignity of human life on a solid footing. It seeks to rescue the reality of persons from a physicalist captivity, to secure the value of human subjectivity and agency. It levels up rather than down, lifting human selves or souls toward transcendence without betraying our embodied partnership with nature. seeking the significance of human subjectivity, agency, and creativity, reveals the wise insight that physicalist reductions of humanity to inhuman events and processes can fund an unethical assault on human beings. Coming to Mind is generous in sharing a vast erudition. It situates its project in a number of intellectual contexts, all developed with impressive scholarship and philosophical analysis. And Coming to Mind is courageous in fundamentally opposing the regnant scientistic and materialist paradigm of our age. It does so boldly but responsively. It is always conversant but never conformist with the relevant neuroscience and philosophy of mind. Yet it makes its own way, pushing the current discourse against its grain. Coming to Mind is an ambitious book. It wants to, quote, help restore the confidence of modern readers and thinkers about using the word soul, much as Alistair MacIntyre rescued the word virtue and thereby helped to revive a mode of moral philosophy neglected until then, end quote. I'm not much aware of a revival of soul talk, however. The work of Charles Taliaferro and Stuart Getz, whose relevant books precede Coming to Mind by a few years, do indeed defend soul talk, but they do so as dualists, not as emergentists. How that wing of the hoped-for revival relates to this project must be considered. Otherwise, where does one find re-engagement with the soul? I looked in vain in the index of the 2017 823-page Blackwell Companion to Consciousness for an entry. I found nothing. Emergentism, however, does merit a chapter in the volume, but the emphasis is more on its defects than on its strengths. The author, Gerald Vision, offers an, at best, tentative advocacy. When I first read Coming to Mind 10 years ago and wrote a review essay on it, I raised a number of critical questions. On my return to the book in preparation for this symposium, those questions and another few remain pertinent. I would like to raise these questions and to do so in dialogue with other thinkers in the vicinity of Goodman and Karamenico. By putting them in dialogue with some kindred but dissenting views, I hope to bring out the unique features of their book and to indicate its problems in the context of some of the current literature. My questions fall into three areas: questions about emergence, questions about the conflation of self and soul, questions about the hard problem of consciousness. Underlying these is a general discomfort with the concept of soul on the Goodman-Karamenico account. Let's first consider emergence. In the famous dialogue between Simmias and Socrates in the Phaedo, Simmias is perplexed by Socrates' views about the soul's entanglement with the body. For Socrates, if one is not a well-disciplined philosopher, the coarseness and materiality of the body can affect the soul and prevent its return to the divine. Simmias likens Socrates' view to a harmony that emerges from the well-tuned parts of a lyre. The lyre, rough
bunch of them here, yeah.
examples there. The lyre is a complex physical object. When its strings are correctly tuned and played, musical harmony results. The art of tuning and the harmony itself are akin to the beauty of divinity. For Socrates, as Simmias understands him, the harmony can endure after the lyre is destroyed. But Simmias cannot see how that would be possible. The soul, qua harmony, cannot survive the destruction of the lyre. Since Socrates is committed to the indestructibility of the soul, he has to distance his account from Simmias' metaphorical rendering of it. Simmias has given us something like an emergent account of the soul. It is emergent in a simple way. The harmonic music develops out of, but has very different properties than the lyre. is dependent on the lyre, but also, at least with regard to its properties, distinct from the lyre, qua composite of physical constituents. The account stops short, however, of emergence in a strong sense. The harmony exercises no causal influence on the lyre. The causality is entirely bottom-up. Socrates is looking for a soul that moves the physical bodies in which it resides. So merely at the level of physics, Simmias' account of the soul does not suffice. An emergent soul without causal power would not be a soul for Socrates, nor for Goodman and Karamenico. In a sense, what Goodman and Karamenico, I have to say, Karamenico for me was just a name. You know, one of the nice things about this is I've gotten to know Greg. What Goodman and Karamenico offer is a hybrid between Simmias and Socrates' views. Like Simmias, their view offers a soul that grows out of the proper functioning of, in this case, a biological system. It comprises a higher level organization that depends on but has different properties from its basal physical constituents. Unlike Simmias' view, and more like Socrates, the emergent soul also has causal power. It is a subject, an agent, a motivating and integrating force. However, unlike Socrates' view, their account of the soul is neither one of substance nor of property dualism. It is a straightforward, although fundamentally unexplained consequence of biological organization at a high level of complexity. It remains a naturalism, although not one reducible to known laws of physics or biology. Also, unlike Socrates' view, the soul is not immortal. It remains bound to a physical body that is doomed, in the not-too-distant future, to cease functioning. If it were equally rational to choose among these views, we would probably opt to split the difference between Simmias and Socrates, as Goodman and Karamenico do, but add at least the bare possibility of Socratic post-mortem survival. I know that I would. This is roughly the view of William Hasker. Hasker calls his account emergent dualism, stress dualism. He wants to affirm emergence, but also push the ontological status of the emergent soul entity beyond where Goodman and Karamenico find it prudent to stop. So let me briefly consider Hasker's view. Like Goodman and Karamenico, Hasker thinks that emergence is maximally concerned not simply with mental properties, but with what he calls emergent individuals. Mental properties, he writes, quote, cannot be explained in terms of the properties exhibited by matter in simpler non-biological configurations. It, emergentism, claims that these properties cannot be explained in terms of, that is, they are not logical consequences of any combination of properties of and relations between the material constituents of the brain. A conscious experience simply is a unity, so to decompose it into a collection of separate parts is to falsify it. So it is not enough to say that there are emergent properties here. What is needed is an emergent individual, a new individual entity which comes into existence as a result of a certain functional configuration of the material constituents of the brain and its nervous system, end quote. I think this is in the neighborhood of coming to mind. It is the emergence of, quote, a new individual entity, end quote, that makes the complex relations among basal properties into a unified conscious mental field. Once the individual entity emerges, the, quote, mental field as that individual's experience becomes a new higher order fact about the universe, every bit as real as the lower level material constituents and relations. Like Goodman and Karamenico, Hasker argues against the causal closure of the physical, the famous Jaegwon Kim phrase. Hasker sees teleology and intentionality, two essential features of mental life, as, quote, basic level phenomena, end quote, rather than as the result of, quote, the result of an interpretation, by what, by whom, one might ask, of processes which in their intrinsic nature are neither purpose-driven nor intentional, end quote. So once emerged, mental properties are the properties of a subject, and the subject is irreducible. Furthermore, once this individual emerges, it has causal agency, and indeed, for Hasker, libertarian free will. The emergent conscious subject, given its, quote, field of consciousness, modifies and directs the functioning of the physical brain, end quote. All of this is broadly shared by Goodman and Karamenico. Hasker is nonetheless at pains to make his emergent dualism compatible with Christian views of an afterlife, especially in the form of bodily resurrection. He inquires into whether an emergent individual could survive the demise of its corporeal basis. After critically evaluating the views of Van Inwagen, Zimmerman, and others, Hasker allies himself with Roger Penrose and with the neuroscientist Wilder Penfield. Penrose has claimed that after the collapse of the star that has caused a black hole, we should, quote, think of the black hole as a self-sustaining gravitational field in its own right. It has no further use for the body which originally built it, end quote. The field generated by a material object could persist in the absence of that object. This plays well with Hasker's earlier analogy of consciousness is to brain as electromagnetic field is to magnet. Similarly, Wilder Penfield wonders whether, quote, there is such a thing as communication between man and God, and whether energy can come to the mind of man from an outside source after his death, end quote. So Hasker concludes, quote, both these scenarios model possible ways in which God could sustain the lives of human persons after their biological death, end quote. Arguably, it is because of his openness to speculations or hopes of this order that Hasker calls his view emergent dualism. That is, he wants to demarcate it from what he calls traditional dualism, but also to preserve an affiliation with some of what motivates traditional substance dualism. And here I think he differs from Goodman and Karamenico. Part of the difference between Hasker and Goodman and Karamenico has to do with theological views external to their respective emergentisms. Hasker is at home in the contemporary thought world of Christian philosophy, with its intriguing use of logical and analytic rigor in support of more or less orthodox doctrine. Such a religious orientation is far from Goodman's, but part of the difference has to do with the ontological status ascribed to the soul. Although certainly an emergentist, Hasker describes his position as dualist, in consequence of which he believes that new physical laws, emergent laws he calls them, discontinuous with the known laws of physics, are required to describe emergent mental reality. Goodman and Karamenico do no such thing. Coming to mind is in this way more chaste than the emergent self. Goodman and Karamenico stay closer to what they think the science allows than Hasker. Or to put it another way, all accept the same basic science, but Hasker is more willing to contextualize the science in a theistic and non-naturalistic frame than are Goodman and Karamenico. The latter endorse a more consistent, albeit capacious, non-reductionist naturalism than does Hasker. This becomes clear in their respective treatments of evolution. Hasker follows Plantinga in arguing that, quote, if we accept the physicalist premises of causal closure and the supervenience of the mental, Darwinist epistemology flunks out completely. It has no ability whatever to explain how any of our conscious mental states have even the most tenuous hold on objective reality. On physicalism and supervenience, the occurrence and content of conscious mental states, such as belief and desire, are irrelevant to behavior and are not subject to selection pressures. On this assumption, natural selection gives us no reason to assume that the experiential content of mental states corresponds in any way whatever to objective reality. And since on the physicalist scenario, Darwinist epistemology is the only available explanation for the reliability of our epistemic faculties, the conclusion to be drawn is that physicalism not only has not given any explanation for such reliability, but it is in principle unable to give any such explanation, end quote. The conclusion that Hasker draws from this is that evolutionary explanation, at least as it is deployed by philosophical physicalists, is incoherent and incompetent to explain consciousness, intentionality, and true belief. Evolution as such is not jettisoned, rather the mechanistic causal view of evolution has got to go. Although Hasker doesn't further develop the point, his stated indebtedness to Plantinga suggests that he follows the latter's view that standard naturalism undermines the very science it seeks to support, the so-called evolutionary argument against naturalism. Evolution on naturalism can give us adaptive behaviors supported by beliefs, but there is no way of grounding whether such beliefs are reliable or warranted. Without the confidence that one's cognitive faculties are reliable, confidence in the very belief in evolution interpreted as naturalism undermines itself. If we want to preserve evolution, we need to wean it away from naturalism and see its best background story as theism. So I think that's Plantinga and Hasker. Goodman and Karamenico do not interpret evolution along mechanical causal lines. Their version of Darwinism is compatible with, indeed demands, teleology. Greg was just talking about purposiveness and agency. They do, however, fit the development of consciousness into an evolutionary story without Hasker and Plantinga's epistemological worries. Goodman and Karamenico write, quote, sorting the varieties of sentience, we can track the emergence of consciousness in evolutionary terms. Planaria, as high school biology students learn, will migrate toward sugar and avoid vinegar. I have to say, I got a little distracted there because this line made me feel so good. It brought me back to 9th grade biology and seeing planaria under the microscope for the first time. It was a wonderful moment for me. Okay. Planaria, as high school biology students learn, will migrate toward sugar and avoid vinegar. The reflective awareness of self and others on which we humans pride ourselves stands at the far end of the spectrum, grounding the subjectivity that affirms itself as a personality. In this picture, consciousness emerges from the self-awareness and other awareness of non-human animals and of our evolutionary ancestors. It is adaptive. The eventual emergence of a unified human self would be, quote, an evolutionary imperative, end quote. The development of consciousness as well as agency fits unproblematically into a naturalistic evolutionary story. At this point, I want to introduce what I think would be David Chalmers' critique of this line of reasoning. So, no more Hasker, moving to Chalmers. Chalmers is well known for describing the problem of consciousness as a hard problem. The easy problems of consciousness have to do with explaining cognitive abilities and functions. These include, quoting Chalmers, the ability to discriminate, categorize, and react to environmental stimuli, the integration of information by a cognitive system, the reportability of mental states, the ability of a system to access its own internal states, the focus of attention, the deliberate control of behavior, the difference between wakefulness and sleep. End quote. Given the ambiguities of the term consciousness, many writers believe, according to Chalmers, that an adequate explanation of these problems of capability and function would amount to an adequate explanation of consciousness. But Chalmers demurs. The hard problem is that of experience, of the irreducibly subjective character of what it is to be like a living subject in whom all of these capabilities and functions are centered. The question of consciousness, of the Hegelian what is it like, is radically different from the other questions. That the exercise of these capabilities or the process of these functions is accompanied by experience is, Chalmers says, a central mystery. Quote, there is an explanatory gap between the functions and experience, and we need an explanatory bridge to cross it. A mere account of functions stays on one side of the gap. To explain experience, we need a new approach. The usual explanatory methods of cognitive science and neuroscience do not suffice. These methods have been developed precisely to explain the performance of cognitive functions, and they do a good job. But as these methods stand, they are only equipped to explain the performance of functions. When it comes to the hard problem, the standard approach has nothing to say. End quote. Thus, for Chalmers, the continuum that Goodman and Karamenico posit between perception, consciousness, memory, and so on, as well as the embeddedness of these phenomena within an evolutionary frame, is in principle incapable of explaining consciousness, his special sense of experience. Despite the fact that their emphasis on the emergence of selfhood pointedly takes the reality of selves, souls, to be its explanandum, their explanatory approach falls on the wrong side of the gap, pace Chalmers. Whether one takes this putative criticism of Chalmers to be serious depends on the stance vis-a-vis the hard problem. On my reading, coming to mind implicitly denies that there is, on principle, a hard problem, which is, I think, a legitimate position. It's not a position I'm any longer persuaded of, but I think it's a legitimate position, and there's no adjudication of this problem. The easy problems are hard enough, I'd say, on the Goodman-Karamenico view. There's no logically recalcitrant hard problem to be addressed. Okay, I want to hit this now from another angle, that of Chalmers' own view of emergence. So, Chalmers argues for two kinds of emergence, strong and weak. And his use of these terms, I think, is a little bit different from how other people use them, maybe than how Len and Greg use strong and weak. I think of strong emergence as making ontological claims, and I think of weak emergence as making epistemological claims and being skeptical about the ontological status of emergent entities. That's not how Chalmers uses it. A high-level phenomenon is, quote, weakly emergent with respect to a low-level domain when the high-level phenomenon arises from the low-level domain, but truths concerning that phenomenon are unexpected given the principles governing the low-level domain. He italicizes unexpected, so that's weak emergence. This is by far the more prevalent kind of emergence, as well as the kind most discussed in the literature. And he, I think, finds this unproblematic. Strong emergence, by contrast, refers to a high-level phenomenon that is not only unexpected, but, quote, truths concerning it are not deducible, even in principle, from truths in the low-level domain, end quote. For Chalmers, there's only one potential example of strong emergence, and that is consciousness, in the sense of what it is like experience. The explanatory gap between accounting for weakly emergent phenomena and strongly emergent phenomena walls such consciousness off from an evolutionary framework of explanation. Evolution, for Chalmers, is a weakly emergent game. Quote, intelligence and many other interesting properties emerge over the course of evolution by genetic recombination, mutation, and natural selection, end quote. But what it is like experience does not. So Chalmers calls his view naturalistic dualism. Given the hard problem and the explanatory gap between natural selection and phenomenal consciousness, Chalmers posits that experience is fundamental. It is, quote, a fundamental feature of the world alongside mass, charge, and space-time, end quote. Experience depends on physical processes, but cannot be reduced to them nor deduced from them. A theory of conscious experience would provide us with the extra ingredient, his term, that bridges the physical and the experiential. Quote, this position qualifies as a variety of dualism, as it postulates basic properties over and above the properties invoked by physics. But it is an innocent version of dualism, entirely compatible with the scientific view of the world. It expands the ontology slightly, to be sure, but Maxwell did the same thing with electromagnetic charge and electromagnetic forces, end quote. Unlike Colin McGinn, Chalmers is no Mysterian. He thinks that a scientific theory of consciousness is possible. In his own proposal, it is remarkable how little he relies on emergence. Having characterized conscious experience as strongly emergent, the evolution of weakly emergent functions and capabilities cannot bridge the explanatory gap. So he proposes a psychophysical principle that correlates more with physics than biology. His admittedly speculative view is that, quote, information, or at least some information, has two basic aspects, a physical aspect and a phenomenal aspect. This has the status of a basic principle that might underlie and explain the emergence of consciousness from the physical. Experience arises by virtue of its status as one aspect of information when the other aspect is found in physical processing, end quote. How or why this view stops short of panpsychism is not immediately clear to me. I hope at any rate to have problematized the account of emergence, evolution, and the status of the hard problem in coming to mind through consulting these other works in the neighborhood. To go on. Of course, the center of gravity of coming to mind is not consciousness. It is selfhood, agency, the soul. The book is meant to debunk confident claims, such as Francis Crick's flamboyant assertion, you, your joys, your memories, and your ambitions, your sense of identity and your free will are in fact no more than the behavior of a vast assembly of nerve cells and their attendant molecules. A famous, infamous quote. A less flamboyant, but no less confident variant is Bruce Hood's claim in his 2012 The Self-Illusion. Hood writes, "Are we like a factory made up of lots of autonomous little workers inside our heads, carrying out all the various tasks and functions that humans can achieve? To some extent we are, in that many of the subdivisions can operate independently. But there is not a worker army of homunculi any more than there is a chief executive in charge. Rather, our minds are a multitude of different processes and decisions that are often in conflict with each other, which can often occur below our level of consciousness. This is why we will need to abandon the notion of internal individuals, which is inadequate to explain the complexity of our brain, and ultimately discard the notion that an inner self exists." End quote. Goodman and Karamenico are committed to a maximal version of emergent selfhood where the self or soul is not just a higher level of organization, but an entity. The self is an ontological individual entitled to that status by its causal efficacy. Quote, "The reality of souls stands or falls with agency. If persons influence the future, persons are real, soul being the name for what makes a person distinctively a person, and not a zombie or a machine. If our actions reflect our choices and not just the play of past events, human agency bespeaks a subject irreducible to the conditions that surround it or the composite that grounds it. Souls affirm themselves insofar as things might have gone otherwise without some person's active choice." Soul or self, end quote. Soul or self has an emergent autonomy that complicates the principle of the causal closure of the physical. Rather than the cynosure of naturalism, Kim's supervenience account of mental causation looks like an overly generalized, rigidified, and impoverished version of naturalism from Goodman and Karamenico's perspective. What interests me here is the strength of the claim to autonomous, agentic, emergent selfhood. How reified is the self on this account? Quote, "Souls, we argue, are emergent beings," end quote. What really motivates this insistence on an entitative self? Is it a matter of doing justice to our own self-evident experience? Does the science of perception, memory, and action logically require it? Are psychologists such as Hood hapless prisoners of a physicalist, reductionist worldview who are forced, like their behaviorist predecessors, to make extremely strange claims as consequences of their lockstep scientism? Take a breath after that sentence. Something like the latter is the argument of Mary Midgley's Are You an Illusion?, which is a really fun little book if you don't know it. I really like Mary Midgley. I recommend her. She sees the philosophical, psychological, and neuroscientific abolition of the self as the sorry consequence of a long history of the declining plausibility of the soul on a standard dualistic version of that notion. Goodman and Karamenico are doing something else. For them, I think the science does not work on any reductionist account. It is a matter of preserving the appearances, as it were, but it is also a matter of rescuing the science from scientism, which, if I'm right about that, that's a real service. I cannot enter into that debate, but I do wonder about the presumed necessity of postulating selves in order to do justice to our self-conception. Consider a parallel. If there were a fact of the matter, and compatibilism rather than full libertarian free will turned out to be correct, would that undermine our moral agency, indeed our moral lives? I don't see why it would. Did Kant, who stressed both physical determinism in a Newtonian universe and the need to believe in a moral order of freedom governed by a moral law, both inexplicable on determinism, thereby undermine ethics? To observe Kant's struggles with this conundrum in the Grundwerk is sobering and inspiring. He is dealing with extremely deep conflicts vis-a-vis the nature of reality and the nature of the human. In short, I think it is possible, even desirable, to live with the agon of contending world pictures. That contention, that struggle to ground and sustain human agency and creativity in a way that resists reconciliation with scientific world pictures, from my point of view, increases human stature. Finally, on my rereading, coming to mind, I noticed that as crucial as soul, the word soul, is to the project, the word is often used interchangeably with self or person. All of these are intentionally set off against mind, a term that Goodman and Karamenico think came to dominate Anglophone philosophy for less than impeccable reasons. Goodman and Karamenico are too careful as writers for this to be mere looseness. Given their explicit non-dualist presentation of the soul, what difference does the word bring to these essays on the agentic, autonomous, emergent self? How seriously should we take the soul on the Goodman-Karamenico view? At the level of rhetoric, an insufficient but necessary level, it seems to me that soul, that is to say their use of the word soul, satisfies very few. Those looking for a defense of traditional Platonic, Cartesian, Christian, even Jewish understanding of the soul will likely not be satisfied with this Aristotelian, modern, scientific, emergentist account. On the other hand, the neuroscientists at Alia, who might appreciate the book's high regard for their work, will likely not see the Goodman-Karamenico version of a soul hypothesis as essential. I might be wrong about this. Mary Midgley points out that Crick's flamboyant assertion begins with you rather than I. If he were talking about himself, he might have been more troubled by the explanatory gap. That's a good point. Perhaps the scientists, when they are not in the lab, also worry about their working assumptions, also worry about how their working assumptions relate to their personal experience as selves. Nonetheless, I fear that this version of the soul falls between two stools. The target of the book is reductionism, but it might be interesting to turn about and take dualism more seriously. The authors tie dualism, quote, the insistent interest in separate souls, end quote, to talk about death. But, quote, human flourishing links up more naturally with life, end quote. Yes, of course. Nonetheless, it seems to me that both hope for eternal life and philosophical arguments for a dualistic conception of the soul are neither absurd nor exhausted. As skeptical and materialist a philosopher as William Lycan decided, in the name of intellectual honesty, to hold his own feet to the fire and fairly judge traditional substance dualism, Cartesian dualisms, ability to withstand his own and other materialist arguments. In his 2009 article, Giving Dualism Its Due, after reviewing the principal materialist arguments, he concluded that, quote, "The dialectical upshot is that on points and going just by actual arguments, as opposed to appeals to decency and what good guys believe, materialism is not significantly better supported than dualism," end quote. He thinks both the arguments for materialism and dualism fail, and that under the circumstances, one should remain a materialist. There's nothing purely rational about this choice, however. Is there ever? Thus his honest self-criticism. My materialism has never wavered, nor is it about to waver now. I cannot take dualism very seriously. Being a philosopher, of course, I would like to think that my stance is rational, held not just instinctively and scientifically and in the mainstream, but because the arguments do indeed favor materialism over dualism, but I do not think that, though I used to, end quote. I imagine that Goodman and Karamenico may say at this point, yes, exactly, both materialism and dualism fail, all the more reason then to be an emergentist. But of course, it depends on where one stands. A committed dualist, such as Daniel Robinson, sees emergentism as a kind of materialism. I don't think that a conclusive resolution of these conflicts is in the offing. In the end, one must choose which view seems to be the most defensible and plausible. To return to the special work that soul, as opposed to self, does, I conclude with a citation from my 2014 review. Soul allows the authors to reclaim a term with a more religious resonance than self, but does it do some essential conceptual work that self leaves undone? The answer comes rather late in the afterword. The reality of souls declared in the emergent powers of perception, consciousness, and creativity, memory and moral agency, amply points toward links with something higher. It now becomes clear that Goodman and Karamenico favor soul over self, or mind, or person, etc., not only because of the role it plays in their ramified naturalism, but because of the transcendent dimension to which it points. It helps to ground not just our moral agency, but the normative direction of that agency. It helps to ground awe, appreciation, and gratitude. Okay. Fully aware of the leap from nature's, quote, finite beauty and brilliance to its infinite source, the authors see, quote, the facets and achievements of our emergent selves and souls, end quote, as gifts, not givens. God has given creatures, quote, capabilities of self-creation as witness the fact of evolution and the general reality of emergence, of which biological evolution is a special case, end quote. Soul, unlike the less resonant mental or phenomenological, psychological terms, opens up a way of talking about human beings that affirms their rootedness in nature and their simultaneous transcendence of it. The conceptual work that soul does exceeds a mere rhetoric. It allows a bridge to be cast from the sciences to the sacred. Self, person, or subject will not take us that far. Although it emerges most visibly at the end, a religious impulse thus animates the whole work. The severest critic, not I, would say it distorts it. I would say that it works sensitively and responsibly within the horizon of science and naturalism to point over the horizon in a gesture of gratitude. And that gesture will be reciprocated by anyone who reads this book. Okay, thank you.
I heard soul replace consciousness.
And do nothing more than that?
No, a great deal more than that, but I heard it. That's my listening, that in fact replace consciousness. Consciousness isn't even necessary, as I understand soul.
Well, I mean, you can't get to person without consciousness, and person is sort of the workaday term for what, on this ramified account is called soul. But one interesting feature of the book is that consciousness is not like the climax of the book. Creativity is. Consciousness is like an episode on the road of the story of the emergent soul, and so the book doesn't just sort of easily fit into the burgeoning, neurophilosophy literature on consciousness, inspired by the hard problem, and so on. And that, I think, is part of the book's distinction. It doesn't treat consciousness as a hard problem. It doesn't have an explanation for consciousness, but doesn't seem to think that this is something that's going to require a complete overturning of science as we have it.
But how does this not deny dualism? I mean, I hear a monistic explanation here, that it's of one substance, but then I hear that there's something superordinate to, that it's an evolution, that we reach at a certain point, that transcendent capacity that we have in the soul for identifying with this unknowable, transcendent good, God, let's say. Somehow,
so why is their view not a dualism?
Yeah.
Well, at least in their own terms, and I must say it's weird representing them. But I guess I'm the Maturgamon, right?
Yeah. I'll get my turn. It's not my turn now.
I'm doing the Aramaic translation of the Torah here. I mean, because I think in their own terms they picture dualism in its high octane, Cartesian version, and they just there's a claim of ontological status that they don't associate their understanding of soul with. It's a more Aristotelian account than a Platonic account, let's say. Yeah. And they want to rehabilitate the Aristotelian account because they think that and I don't think they're at all wrong about this, it dovetails with what the contemporary science allows much better than a Platonic account would. And I think the reference to MacIntyre at the very first pages of the book and what MacIntyre did for virtue, it's apt in this way too, because MacIntyre, he wasn't the first one, but he's sort of, I think, the most effective or efficacious one of bringing back Aristotelian moral philosophy. I mean, it never went away in terms of history of ethics, but the serious turning to virtue ethics as Aristotelian virtue ethics as a major focus of contemporary moral philosophizing. That's a big, really a big return to Aristotle. So, in their own terms, it's not a dualism. I think if you want to step outside their semantic range, you could construe this book as a sort of property dualism, but I think they also want to talk about more than properties. They want to talk about emergent entities. But I'd be very interested for you to ask that question to Len.
Yeah,
you did
a good. But I did think you did a good job of pointing out that it's not just about properties.
Well, now wait a minute. I read you guys as more or less aggressively pluralistic,
not
Look, I
monistic.
think if we're going to use terms like this, we have to
Well,
define
you're-
our terms.
You're using
Your
pluralism as
Democritean,
slang.
your constant return to everybody's got Democritus wrong, but if you get Democritus right, what you get is a really nice rationalistic pluralism.
That's interesting. I don't.
Well, it's in the book
I
over and over.
Huh.
I don't know whether it must not be you, it must be Lynn. Over and over,
The
Democritus
Democriteanism?
comes up again and again and again.
But more in an illustrative manner.
No, this book is not a vindication of Democritus. Alan is right, and the theory here is very Aristotelian. It's non-reductive. If we're going to talk about whether it's dualism or not, whether it's substance or property dualism and so forth, we have to let the people who want to apply those labels define them as best they can, then we'll see if they fit. Look, we think that something, and this is Aristotle, something is real if it can act. We think on those
That's
grounds
pluralism.
that the soul, we think that on those grounds the soul is something real. If that is something that somebody wants to call a form of dualism, that's okay. They can put any label on it they want. We think that the soul is a thing that is active. If you want to ask, do Goodman and Karamenico think that the soul is a substance? That's going to depend on what you mean by a substance.
Yeah.
Some people think that the substance of this table is wood. They identify the word substance with matter. We do not think, and we say repeatedly, that soul is not a special super or material thing which is non-physical because it can walk through walls. Like if you used to watch Cosmo and Topper's Ghost and so forth, right? The soul is not a physical thing because it's not of the order of such things.
And if it's not physical, it can't be metaphysical. In that
It
sense,
doesn't
yeah.
walk through walls. Our argument is not about immortality. Our argument is not about abortion. If people want to use the word soul in the rhetoric of such discussions, they are welcome to do so, but that is not the way we use the word soul in this book. Alan and others have gotten it quite right. You got it right too, in saying that the notion of soul as we use it does point in a transcendental direction. It is not reducible to matter. Our interest in emergence is in that fact, that it is not reducible to the physical parts of which the body is composed. We think it's emergent in the sense that given the kind of biological constitution that we have, we become capable of doing things that are not explicable in terms of the parts out of which we're made. You want to call that dualism? It's okay with me. I don't know whether it's property dualism. These are not my terms. I don't use that language. Property dualism, substance. It's nonsensical to me. Pluralism, Randy. To me, Democritus is a pluralist. He thinks there are different things. I don't think he thinks there are different kinds of things, and that would be of greater interest
Well,
in the
but you
present context.
point out that he calls the things self-active intelligences. So in other words, they're not little particles that are dead. They act. And to me, non-reductionism and pluralism
Dawkins thinks that genes act, and after being terribly angry about anthropomorphism about people, he goes ahead and anthropomorphizes genes.
That also, the way you describe democracy, that also sounds very Lucretian. Like from the part where we,
It's a
I'm
certain
remembering
reading.
that came up more than once.
It's a
and
certain
we
reading.
edited out some of the times it comes up.
It's a certain reading of Lucretius. It's not the way I read Lucretius.
But Alan did, I thought, a really good job of pointing out why we reject the heart problem in its most sort of formulation is most intractable. I would just say that I've become even more sympathetic to gradualist evolutionary explanations of the gradations of how you get to consciousness.
Yeah.
And I I would say that if anything, I'm more comfortable using the word soul now, but less using the word emergence. So.
Well, I'm gonna, when I get my turn, it's not fair to do it now in Alan's time, but when I get my turn, I'm gonna say some things about emergence. I've already said a couple. I don't think that emergence is a mystical term, and I don't think it should be used in that fashion. I think it's a logical term. I think it has its roots, as you pointed out, in John Stuart Mill, in the logic that he wrote. He didn't use the term yet, but others picked up the concept from him and applied that term. It's a very useful term. I'll say a few words about it when it's my turn to speak. But whether you want to apply a certain label to the view that we've taken is going to depend upon what you mean by that term. And once I know what you mean by that term, I guess I can plead guilty or plead innocent or whatnot. But I don't think the project of coming to mind is at all about the classical issues of Cartesian dualism. It's about recognizing that the soul is a different order of being. It is not a quasi-physical thing, which is the easiest way to imagine it, but the most problematic way to conceptualize it.
Is that to say that consciousness is a component of the soul?
Consciousness is an activity of the soul, of course.
Okay.
But as Greg brought out very nicely, there are counterparts to consciousness, among other beings. There's a passage about the planaria. The planaria doesn't just move in that direction. That's a viciously behavioristic way of describing what happens to the planaria. If the planaria can feel the difference between vinegar and sugar in solution, that is because there's an internal awareness of some kind, even in the planaria. If your sunflower faces the sun, we can allow that that's a mechanical reaction. The sunflower does not have any form of consciousness, but it does have the ability to respond using its hormones
How
also.
do you know that the planaria is not functioning by the same mechanism?
No, it's not functioning by the same mechanism,
It's not
but it's functioning.
phototrophism, but yeah.
No, but it's the planaria has mechanisms that are analogous to the mechanisms that you and I feel. The planaria is doing something analogous to what happens if you put your hand on the hot pot and forgot that you just took it out of the oven and you draw back like that. The exact mechanism's a little different, but the evolutionary basis of that mechanism is present in all of us, all living animals.
Which is different from what the sunflower reacts.
That's correct.
Yeah, and it's
The
different.
sunflower's using a different hormone system.
Yeah, and it's different depending on what
So-
animal, so who knows?
Of course, of
Greg,
course.
is it Greg? Okay, so going back to Chalmers, I'd like to address this, and I deviate from Bob on, I agree with Daniel Dennett that for biologists there is no hard problem of consciousness, that Chalmers makes a category area tautologically that it isn't emergentism, it is convergent, this idea of mind, that what we're seeing is we got there first, but we have analogous, throughout biology, analogous mind, and that emergentism, which is homologous, is the problem. So there is no hard problem of consciousness for biologists, and that's Daniel Dennett. So I subscribe to that. If you might comment on that, if you've looked at perhaps that it isn't emergentism, but it's more a convergent phenomenon that we're seeing, and humans just happen to have gotten there first in the
First ahead of what?
in the
I'm not following.
evolutionary. So, pardon me?
Behind, what comes behind humans, if humans are first?
Yeah, so we got there first, but I mean,
First
but-
ahead of what?
Who's
That
after
that
us?
sounds backwards.
Blue
as far
whales.
as we got there first in terms of consciousness, in terms of mind, because we're not the only species
But did we get there first, in the
No,
sense that
other animals got there
Yeah.
first. We came later.
we're late?
Right, but yeah, so the phenomenon in evolution of convergence, where we see other properties that aren't related to an evolutionary process, but a convergence of exhibited in nature.
Can you follow it?
Yeah, I don't know about that, but I mean, Dennett doesn't like consciousness. He likes thinking. He likes the intentional stance, but he doesn't see consciousness as
He sees consciousness as an illusion, really.
He wants to explain it away.
yeah. And Chalmers is 180 degrees away from this. I mean, he sees consciousness is the primary thing that needs to be explained and resists explanation.
And he said it's
doesn't wanna-
irreducible. You quoted him twice on that.
Yeah, so for Chalmers to get off the ground, you have to, I think, believe that there's nothing, logically self-undermining about zombies. If you could do everything that we do, but there's no one home inside,
Right.
then experience becomes this very hard problem. If you think that thought experiment is unhelpful, impossible, self-defeating to begin with, then you're puzzled by why Chalmers is so puzzled by consciousness. And back when I read this book, and I was doing some reading in this area in order to write
your own book.
this one here, Human Nature and Jewish Thought. I got into some of the so-called neurophilosophy. I was puzzled by why he would think that the hard problem is hard, why he'd think that there's this categorical explanatory gap between things like awareness, self-awareness, a kind of mental homeostasis, awareness of our internal states and so on, and why there's a gap between biological, naturally selected processes and that. But I have to say, over the intervening decade or so, the hard problem does seem more genuinely hard to me. So I just can't buy Dennett. I mean, Dennett seems to me to be a sort of 2.0 version of Gilbert Ryle, his teacher.
That's good.
And I think the way Chalmers functions for me is kind of ingraining the explanatory difficulty on principle. It doesn't foreclose eventual explanation, but I think that there is this principled problem of getting from third-person discourse, causal explanatory language, to first-person experiential discourse. And I think that Nagel's famous 1973, whatever his question, what is it like to be a bat, is a real question, to which a Dennettian answer is unilluminating.
Your example of zombieism is an impossibility.
That was his point.
Okay, yeah.
That was exactly his point. If you're not prepared to admit that zombies can be real, which would be not comic strip zombies, but creatures that behave just like we do, only as Ellen eloquently put it, there's nobody home inside. That would be that would be if you're not prepared to admit that such creatures are conceptually possible, then you have run out of steam as far as denying the reality of
And
consciousness.
the next step would be, what of artificial intelligence?
Well, so far,
Is that what zombie is?
nobody's home. And, their hallucinations notwithstanding.
Okay.
There's no subject there that's hallucinating. But who knows where that's going? The thing with they're not zombies in the technical thought experiment sense, because in the technical thought experiment sense, there's a micro-physical property identity between me and my zombie. That is, we have the same collection of molecules, we have the same organization, we have the same everything, except the zombie me is not experiencing the world the way I
Okay, so
do.
the analogy isn't really a good one with artificial intelligence.
No.
No.
There's some recent work on that actually that's kind of talked about what AI might be affecting some of the same actions or solving the same problems, but it doesn't have the one-to-one correspondence between the individual and their zombie.
Okay.
I got a online question. Myron, you still there? Oh, he pulled his hand down. He may have. Oh, there he is.
Yes, I am. I'm so sorry. Thank you. It kind of piggybacks off was just being discussed. So, I did want to ask about the soul of the chatbot, or the soulness
Of the chatbot.
I was, and thank you for your talk, by the way. I really enjoyed it. I was concerned about to go in the non-reductionist route. If you look at the history of theophanic experiences or theopoetic experiences, you get human civilizations that have this kind of, it's been said that the earth is a kind of a graveyard of gods and goddesses and deities, because they emerge and then they undergo this process, and then there's a twilight of the gods that occurs. And anthropologists differ, but they say that there's an inventory, of 36,000, 43,000, whoever you're talking to, you get a different estimate, but it's around the same range of a kind of pluralistic theophany. And I was wanting to know whether or not, on this account, those gods have souls, in the sense of not just an emergent consciousness, but the way in which they are symbolized or at least worshipped and ritualized and practiced throughout this long history of various human civilizations, or which is basically monotheists struggle with this, of course, because they tend to just overemphasize the axial age, or the foundations of the axial age that bring about just focusing on certain gods and deities. But then I wanted to ask, of course, how this relates to the chatbot that comes along that kind of imitates the divine in this way. You get the emergence of the chatbot, and with the transformation of computing power, you go into a new version, which is the twilight of the old version. And we all understand that in the age of reformatting, in terms of our digital and technological setups. I finally wanted to end it by saying I do recognize a kind of dualism, and that is in the development of human civilizations. With the Industrial Revolution, you get us overcoming the limitations of our muscles. Through machinery, through technology, human beings overcame in a lot of ways the limitations of our muscles, of our bodies. And this is why we can no longer argue that we're too little or too small to not be responsible, to have to take care of Mother Nature, so to speak. But now I believe we're undergoing a new industrial kind of revolution, which is the computer age, the information age, and we're overcoming the limitations of our minds. And that's what a lot of the chatbot and this kind of post-transhumanism represents. And so I was curious as to where does the soul fit into this kind of structure where consciousness in the old seems to be possibly withering away or undergoing its twilight. Because what I was getting from much of your talk was a kind of possibly antiquated notion of consciousness related to a soul that may be more in the sense of the gods and not more in the sense of a futuristic artificial intelligence. So thank you.
You're welcome. Well, I'm trying to think what I want to grab onto here.
That's why it's good to be online.
So, I mean, I'm agnostic about religious experience. Those 36,000 or 43,000 dead gods buried in the earth that you referenced, the human religious imagination is boundless, right? So why only 36 or 43,000? You know, why not however many billions of people have lived on Earth over the millennia, gods? If there's no voracious religious experience, then this is all, cultural symbols, and they may symbolize things that are essential to human life, to social life, to our internal psychological experience and so on, but you need, a demythologization, Entmythologisierung, right? You have to do a Bultmann analysis of them and just deconstruct religious symbols as existential markers. But if religious experience is experience of something real, it gets more interesting. I'm open to this, but as I say, I'm agnostic about it. So on the supposition that religious experience being so universal and synchronic, that it's a human universal, and it should be seen not just as widespread delusion, but as something that might bear truth. On that supposition, I would have to ask, what do the religious experiences of people before the axial age and since the axial age as well? What are they of? What do they mean? So I'm a monotheist. I don't, I wouldn't put it on a bumper sticker or something. 'Cause, I'm a religious Jew. That sounds more real to me than monotheist. But I wouldn't put that on a bumper sticker either, especially these days.
There used to be a group that put bumper stickers on cars which said, "I found it." You may remember this if you're old enough.
Okay.
And I had a friend who made up some rival bumper stickers which said, "We never lost it."
So,
If I may, my bumper sticker says, "Buckle up." It makes it makes it harder for the aliens to suck you out of your car seat.
Very good, very good.
Probably ties into the I found.
so I would just say that I like what the early 20th century Jewish philosopher Franz Rosenzweig says, that the Carthaginian parent, the Carthaginian father, who was about to sacrifice his child to Moloch and was praying for mercy, was actually praying to the God of Israel, but he didn't know it. Rosenzweig wants to say that there's something genuine about religious experience. The real object of religious experience is, the true God, and you could say that's the extension of any God concept. It's just that many God concepts are hopelessly confused. But at the greatest human depth, for Rosenzweig, all of the genuine experiences of the divine are experiences of God, the God of Israel. You have that also in Catholic theology with Karl Rahner and the idea of anonymous Christianity.
Would you characterize a near-death experience as a form of religious experience?
I don't know anything about this, either on a first-person basis or I haven't really read anything about it, but a friend of mine who's recently retired professor, one of his areas in philosophy of mind, he puts great stock into these near-death experiences. He believes they can't be physiologically explained, that the physiology at that extremity, under those circumstances, would point in the other direction. So he's someone who thinks that should be considered an experience that is resistant to any kind of debunking. And he's very fond of William James, and William James is setting up, with his British counterparts, an institute to study, I guess, what we today call paranormal phenomena, and the medium, the Boston medium, whom he had an exclusive contractual relationship with. So I must say, I would have, me 10 years ago would have just been kind of surly about all of this and very dismissive of it, but on the basis of taking 5-mile walks every week with my old friend, I've at least become agnostic rather than...
What is his name?
This is Professor Todd Moody, who's written a few books, and he's the one. I should thank him on camera here for bringing the William Lycan article to my attention. Another relevant article he brought to my attention is Barbara Montero, The Body Problem, a way of undermining the classic mind-body problem by greatly complicating the body side of the mind-body problem, and all kinds of other technical contemporary things like that. But I think what... we're way over time.
Well, I mean, Len speaks at 6, and it's nowhere near 6.
I mean, what Len was saying before about
We started late.
not being bound to or even very respectful of the jargon of these contemporary, debates and the...
It's very liberating.
Yeah, so I think that is a two-edged sword in some ways. I think it makes for, I just put it out there, the greatness of Len's books. I mean, there's just a vision here that is not only different from, but I think really towers over a lot of the contemporary discourse. And I'm not sure I'd start with this book. Of course, if this is the interest of the group, then by all means start with this book. But they're very important books by him that I think you get really have the finest intellectual experience. I would start with On Justice, which is where I got into this. But okay, so that establishes him as a philosopher, I think, of like 100-year stature. But on the other hand, there's also a real because they don't fit hand in glove into the literature of the guild at any given time.
The boys' club.
The what?
The boys' club.
Yeah, so I think they can be neglected. They can also not be, he's conversant with the literature, but I don't know if the literature is conversant with you. So that's the other side of the two-edged sword. So I agree that to try to fit this vision of what I call a capacious naturalism into the language of substance dualism and property dualism and C fibers and all this neurophilosophy stuff, it doesn't work. I mean, the background metaphysics here is so different from anything you're going to find out there, and that's why I think that's why this stuff really gets you can't adjudicate. You really can't negotiate between these very discrepant fundamental metaphysical visions. You really you have to decide for yourself what is most compelling, plausible, appealing. I don't think that's just a quirk of your own psychological constitution or how you were raised or something. I think you have to devote a really deep introspection and self-interrogation as to what makes the most as a world, makes the most sense for you as your fundamental worldview and spiritual commitment.
You briefly alluded to this a couple of minutes ago. If you could expound briefly on it, what are your thoughts on mediumship?
Mediumship?
Mediumship.
Mediums.
Are there real mediums?
Oh, well, I can safely say I have no thoughts on this. My immediate thought is I don't know. I mean, look, I don't.
The reason I ask is you put it together with near-death experiences.
Yeah, well, I grouped it under paranormal phenomena. I don't know if that's fair, but you don't want to. I don't want to be. I feel like I'm recovering from, even though in that book, Human Nature and Jewish Thought, it was my way of fighting scientism. I was fighting scientism because scientism is attractive to me. It was a self-conflict, and so I feel like I recognize scientism, and I want to hold it at arm's length without holding science at arm's length. But I don't know exactly what sorts of things should be ruled out on principle. I'm willing to be skeptical about near-death experiences, but I think only that's because someone I love and trust has made a good case for them. If someone I love and trust made a good case for mediums, maybe. At the moment, it just seems like I don't want to fall down this rabbit hole of being superstitious. That's not me.
I should have prefaced it. Would you stick your neck out?
You know any friends working on the Origins of the Witch of Endor story? No? Prophet Samuel? No?
Probably somebody at JTS is working on that.
Yeah.
Anyway, thanks.
Thank you.
Thanks, Al.